Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Julia Chen, and I'm the Activities Director at the Yale Club. And I'm so excited to see so many of you joining us for our virtual lecture series, where we bring in a live speaker to do a lecture and Q&A that you can participate in from your homes. Today, we are excited to welcome Dr. Emily Orr. She's the Assistant Curator of Modern and Contemporary American Design at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. She holds a PhD in the History of Design from the Royal College of Art, Victoria and Albert Museum. Her primary areas of scholarship include retail history, industrial design, and consumer culture, and she is the author of Designing the Department Store, Display and Retail at the Turn of the 20th Century, which is also the topic of our talk here today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Orr.
Well, first of all, many thanks to the Yale Club of New York City for inviting me to speak tonight, and particular thanks to Julia Chen for organizing, and to Justin Zaremby for putting my name forward. I am so excited to share some of my favorite stories and images from my research tonight towards my new book, Designing the Department Store, Display and Retail at the Turn of the 20th Century. This book reveals how many of the most important innovations in department store culture can be located within the realm of display design. Display impacted retail architecture, strengthened the development of merchandising tools and technologies, and shaped a new set of design professions. I consider how the department store strategy of display along a range of scales, from a monumental building to a demure hat stand. At the turn of the 20th century, the retail trade shifted from stressing the axiom, goods well bought are half sold, to goods well displayed are half sold. These modifications represented a shift in emphasis from the manufacture of merchandise to the production of the design of display for that merchandise. Stores invested in display that achieved a new agency in the retail space. It was able to attract buyers and encourage purchases. Four interrelated design professions contributed towards this shift in change and outlook: architects, shop fitters, interior designers, and window dressers, who all produced these displays and contributed towards this shift in understanding of the agency and possibility of display in the retail sphere. Architects prioritized display in their retail structures with large show windows, as you see here in this image of Marshall Field and Company from Chicago in 1909. Marshall Field's columns were proclaimed the famous monoliths, lit up at night with spotlights as one of the landmarks on Chicago's major retail thoroughfare. Shop fitters, such as Norwich Nickel and Brass, devised fixtures and customized casework for all of the categories of the department store's sphere of goods, emphasizing diversity and the profusion of the store's stock. For instance, we see here drapery fixtures that encouraged textile swags to sway, and armatures that supported shoes to dance in mid-air. Window dressers and interior designers flattered wares with the most technically complex and artistically ambitious arrangements that were only temporary. Upon the opening of their expansion in 1908, we can see on the left a postcard from what they called an interior decoration event, in which they staged this interior decoration event and no commodities were for sale whatsoever. Retail neighbors and displaymen were invited only to marvel at the skills and techniques of the displaymen on view. In commodity pictures, as we can see on the right, window dressers placed goods in these new and dramatic roles that were entirely divorced from their domestic context. So here we see a clock that has a base of towering textiles made up with a face of toothbrushes, combs, and hairbrushes. The department store was an active space of design production in which architecture, interior design, technologies, and displays were under constant revision and renovation. So here we see an image of a mannequin workshop at a shop fitter outside of London, whose products were shipped and used around the world. These craftsmen were in close contact with the fashion industry, making sure that the mannequins that they produced matched up to the present style that was dictated by the fashion system. So it's by going behind the scenes to spaces such as this shop fitter workshop, or a window dresser studio, or an interior design studio, that we can observe how the department store was more than a space of consumption, but really we can view it as a space of design production. I'm really interested in objects such as mannequins, shop signs, lighting fixtures, rotating stands, and these many other components that were not for sale, but instead facilitated the sale of objects in the department store. And consumers saw with their own eyes this very fast pace of retail and this quickening turnover in both merchandise and display strategy and technique. And the design impact of the department store really thrived on this transience and change. Display windows altered every week, interior decorations changed according to the season and every possible holiday. The department store was continually undergoing renovation by architects and engineers to obtain larger show windows or extra stories or an upgraded restaurant or a new elevator. Little was ever static or fixed in this very modern space. And so restyling was key in order to keep consumer attention and encourage them to come back for a future visit and a new type of design experience. And in preparing for this talk and thinking about this design of display and this very fast pace of retail architecture and visual merchandising, I can't help but think how far we are from that model of the department store. You know, from my position in my contemporary quarantine, time is somewhat irrelevant, and shopping has largely been reduced to the space of the screen. And it seems that we're all that much farther from this kind of historical practice. And I think now more than ever, today's challenges are prompting a critical look at this important history. For instance, for those who do venture to the city's sidewalks, or at least scroll through virtual views of city streets, the physical frame of the show window is really all that we have left of the in-person shopping experience at present. Storefronts have long been associated with themes of progress and change. They register contemporary events and goings-on in their surrounding cities, while also advertising goods and services. And in recent weeks, some stores are using their windows to send messages of hope and perseverance, while others are offering pleas of support for their business or their communities. And in some ways, this use of the show windows strikes me as not so far from historical precedent. These windows have always mixed messages of commoditization, cultural importance, social importance, and current events. But what strikes me most is the stark contrast to these businesses that have in fact blocked out their windows entirely and boarded them up. These stores are denying us the ability to see any merchandise or take in any view of a designed interior. They are entirely reversing the original concept of the show window itself, that earned its name at the 20th century for its ability to show or to make goods and a message conspicuous. So as a transparent but pronounced element of the design of the facade, the show window gave visual access to its transparent quality that was central to its usefulness and influence. The leading retail entrepreneur, John Wanamaker, anthropomorphized the department store when he wrote that the store's facade includes windows that are eyes to meet eyes. Passers-by looked to the show window for the store's vision of what was in fashion. At the same time, they saw their own image reflected in return, due to these material properties of the plate glass. Wanamaker's metaphor also underscored that the store was an active and responsive component of the cityscape. The window's reflective surface not only captured images of the passersby, but also that of the surrounding city and street, as we can see in this photograph. The image of the city became superimposed on the window, visually representing a meaningful alignment between the retail outlet and its urban surroundings. The window's dresser's role, therefore, is of course tied to the space and materiality of the show window itself. Early 19th century show windows appeared as a grid of panes. The view from the street resembled the flat two-dimensional effect of a trade card that the consumer may have been familiar with before approaching the shop. This gridded structure then dictated a rigid display method whereby one good filled one window pane. So here we see that at work and its success really in this hat warehouse where one hat fills one window pane. Here we see how the structure of the window itself, the materiality of the window, the glass, the panes, dictate a display format and a layout that communicated both order and organization. But by the late 19th century, improvements in the glass manufacturing process allowed for the development of increasingly large and more durable sheets of plate glass, allowing windows to be divided into fewer components. So large, flat windows of glass that were free of distortions then substantially altered display practice, display possibility, as well as the consumer experience of retail architecture. This uninhibited, sleek surface proved a distinct shift in approaches to window display. Goods could become acrobatic and even float across a series of windows or carry a narrative theme or structure. A New York newspaper reported that Lord & Taylor's new business palace of iron and glass, built on the corner of Broadway and 20th Street in 1871, attracted attention with plate glass windows 8 in number, each one 7 feet wide and 16 feet high. Stores actively advertised these statistics, proving that they were of public interest, and also consumers compared one store against the other, given these statistics. The more show windows, the more worthy of their business. Therefore, these windows became not only an important feature of retail architecture, but also a determining factor in the department store's construction. The addition of more show windows was one of the leading factors and motivations for the renovation and generation of new commercial buildings. The profession of the window dresser, later also known as the display man, emerged to master the contents and the strategy of this new space behind plate glass. This was pivotal for advertising, and as I said before, the communication of both a message and merchandise on offer. And the profession really got going due to the grouping, the organization of workers in the industry in cities such as New York and Chicago and London, but also the rise of periodicals that were specific to this new trade, advertising skills and techniques, the availabilities of new materials, alignments with modern art, as we'll come to see. And the first to kick off a wave of periodicals around retail design was the show window, founded in 1897, in fact, by L. Frank Baum, who before his authorship of the Oz series was involved in the dry goods trade and theater and really saw the potential for a dramatic display. And here we have 2 of the first issues of this short running periodical that only ran for a few years, beginning in 1897. And you have to note those kind of all-seeing eyes that we see on the November issue there on the left. In September of 1899, his periodical administered a poll based on 380 reports of existing professional window trimmers in the field, and determined that 24% had come from a strictly commercial background and had been clerks or floor walkers. 17% had been unsuccessful merchants. 7% were carpenters and cabinet makers. 6% had worked in the theater. 6% were previously involved with newspapers, 5% were artists, and 4% were sign and scenic painters. Therefore, this creative pursuit of display emerged as a hybrid of existing design professions. The 1894 publication, The Wide Awake Window Dresser, which is a great and important title, provides a rare view of a window dresser's studio that contains all of the tools that go into the framework, the kind of core design principle of the making of a store window. In order to be wide awake in terms of display design, as the book's title suggests, one had to have the right tools at hand to keep up with current styles and possibilities of display. So here we see how the window dresser had access to a wide range of equipment, from mannequins to lighting fixtures and stands. All of this was necessary to build an up-to-date display, or one that was wide awake, which comes to be a term used quite frequently in literature in the period. So this dedicated, well-stocked storeroom allows the window dresser to keep up with an almost relentless pace of production. In major stores and major shopping cities, the window displays were turned over at least once a week. So in order to keep up with that demand, the correct tools were necessary. And no matter what style or message of the show window was executed, no doubt this was very skilled labor and required a range of skilled work and background in many different fields. One journalist advised that to be worthy of the splendid title professional window trimmer, I think one ought to master the following trades: architect, carpenter, electrician, plumber, sign writer, and scenic painter. New technology is also developed to aid the constant demand for changeover. These devices included the patented H. Hunter's show window construction that helped to move assembled displays from the basement upwards towards ground level in the show window. In his patent description, Hunter explained that the current challenges faced by the window trimmer included limited space to do the assembly work at the storefront level, and loss of the window if the dressing was done during the day behind blinds or curtains. So many stores had to sacrifice that valuable advertising space during daylight hours to execute these displays, and as such would put up a curtain or a screen, also kind of reinforcing the theatricality of the window. Consumers would walk by at night and see it under construction, and then walk by in the morning and see a new display unveiled, and the curtains would have opened, much like in a theatrical performance. Some very smart businesses also timed the unveiling of their new window displays to go along with kind of the rhythms of leisure in the city. So for instance, would open a new window display upon the opening of a new play just down the street. Others actually practice something called open dressing, whereby the construction of the window display itself was in fact on view, and in some ways the mystery was revealed. Although this must have been very technically difficult to complete and was not so widely practiced in the field. So in order to address these issues, the logistical challenge of building a display in one place in the store and moving it up to the show window, kind of succinctly keeping everything together and intact, and to ensure a smooth and safe presentation, H. Hunter invented this device called a fixture carrying floor that could be raised or lowered from the basement to move the entire contents of the show window that were assembled rested on a platform. And in fact, we know that many stores implemented these technologies, making the department store into a very kind of mechanically oriented space. And for instance, in Lord & Taylor by 1914, you can read reports of these show window constructions enabling an ever increasing pace of changeover in the store window. So once this understructure had been determined, window dressers arranged goods in a wide variety of display styles. And in looking at period guidebooks and textbooks, advertisements, press accounts, we can kind of put together a canon of window display types that were widely practiced in the retail sphere and presented to the public. So varying and often competing approaches to display that I'll run us through included the stocky window, the sculptural window, and the unit principle. What we see on the screen here is an example of a stocky window. So when window display first began as a field, really in the mid-19th century, most merchandise presentation overwhelmed passersby with quantity and variety, as we see here. Some retailers, I think, believed that it was necessary to display as much stock as possible due to the incredible expense invested in the plate glass and in this kind of advertising space right on the sidewalk. It was had retail value, had real estate value. So from left to right, top to bottom, here we see rows of merchandise jammed together by category: dolls, handkerchiefs, shirts, gloves, hose, picture frames, floral gift boxes, with no kind of cohesive impression or message or attempt at artful presentation. And what's interesting also to note is that many of the slides that I'm showing this evening are for major stores in New York and Chicago. And for the stocky example, I looked to a store in Liverpool because this stocky approach was much more widely practiced in Britain than in America. And this style fell out of favor in part because it was not a flexible enough system to allow for revision or variety. And yet, the textile trade remained the basis of a department store's stock. And after all, the department store had grown out of kind of textile-oriented establishments in major shopping cities earlier in the 19th century. And so it's no surprise then that textiles carry a major category of display within the show window, much more sophisticated than that of the stocky variety. And the ability to manipulate textiles, most notably handkerchiefs, made possible the execution of really ambitious and fantastical arrangements that took advantage of this full expanse of the plate glass window in a much more artful way. Complicated work with white goods was one of the most challenging challenges in the window dresser's repertoire. Cotton goods were pliable, yet sturdy, and could be folded into any number of designs. Layered, they made flowers, they made architectural elements. And here we see this page from a 1902 textbook showing how to make an intricate quatrefoil out of a handkerchief. So out of this very standard and basic stock of textiles, window dressers and other window dressers and displaymen created all kinds of geometric forms, plants, and flowers. And Mr. E. Katz, the accomplished window display designer of the Brooklyn department store Abraham and Straus, produced one of the most magnificent displays that I came across in my research. And notably, this is one of the only images that I found, if not the only, that shows the display man or the window dresser beside his finished product. So many window dressers remain anonymous, and here we have not only a named designer, but an example of his prize-winning display. One of the reasons why probably this photograph survives. He won a contest with this design that was offered by the periodical, The Dry Goods Chronicle. And I think something else interesting to note here is that not only do we see the textiles, on view in quatrefoils, very similar to that page of the textbook shown on the previous slide, but we can also see how the framework of the shop fitting contributes to like this organized yet artful arrangement, a structure that is also on view and decorative itself. And another interesting thing to note is this display's ambitious design also won it reproduction in a December 1899 issue of the periodical The Show Window, where it here becomes a model for other designers to try and replicate in their home cities. Window dressers also built humble objects such as handkerchiefs and spools of thread into figures that carried symbolic weight. And the Brooklyn Bridge was of particular interest and particularly popular around the time of its 1883 completion. And I think there are symbolic links between the Brooklyn Bridge, and this building up of the model of the department store in this period. Both industrial accomplishments represent democratization, specialization, technological achievement. And so this message must have not been lost on consumers, despite the kind of laugh that you might get when you first look at a display such as this. Frank L. Carr, who is the author of the book that I've shown a few pages from, The Wide Awake Window Dresser, designed a Brooklyn Bridge window out of cotton that made particular headlines. And one newspaper claimed in 1901 that his model had been inspected by the chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge, and he pronounced it an exact reproduction in every detail. While certainly this is a fictional report, this attention in the press still goes to show how the technical nature of display design was really a topic of public interest. And also another parallel we find in the world of World's Fairs. While these figural arrangements of commodities might first appear exotic or bizarre, I think it's important to consider them in this larger push towards mass ornament and this kind of sculptural approach of the arrangement of commodities that also appears in the sphere of World's Fairs. This is an aesthetic convention that is being practiced across display contexts. Oftentimes the World's Fair and the department store come into conversation with one another due to their scale and their vast quantity of merchandise and their ability to reach, hundreds, if not thousands, of consumers and potential purchasers. But if we look to display design in particular, there are also a lot of parallels in terms of the execution of these spaces. And something called crop art at the World's Fairs, which we see on the right, expressed a symbolism of abundance that I think is very much in line with these handkerchief windows. At the World's Columbian Exposition, we can see how the state of California presents this old Liberty Bell containing 6,500 oranges in the agricultural hall, and a complete dictionary of dry goods, which was one of the go-to kind of textile encyclopedias of the period that also included a vast section on display at the end. Features a nearly identical schematic for a display design just the year before. So coming to the first decades of the 20th century, we can see how a number of merchants begin to strive for a sparser effect in their show windows. From kind of profusion to exactitude, designers are veering away from the fantastical to a more practical approach. And this is where the unit principle comes into play, where window designers are encouraging concentration on a single good or a set of goods. And I think also this is due to a message about the function and the practicality of the objects not coming across in those more dramatic displays. So while the Brooklyn Bridge may have caught the eyes of many passersby, it didn't do anything to tell one about the function or the particular attractiveness of that model spool of thread. Display was striving more towards a practical approach here and a more artful and elegant approach, one could say. And so here we can see with this textile window how draping comes back into play to show the particular sheen and the weight of the textile on view. And lighting here also plays a large role and does a lot to encourage changeover in the visuality of these windows. So washes of color light could be achieved quite easily, requiring just a single switch of a colored lens on a light apparatus to give an entirely new look to a simple design. The display profession also starts to capitalize on its alignment with modern art as evidence of its wide awake practice. So just weeks following the Armory show, New York's Economist Trading School used a cubist drape to advertise its training program, advocating that current tendencies in art find first expression here. This drape no longer imitates the female form, but instead embraces the non-figural and took the shape of a cubist structure. In April of 1913, the dry goods economist encouraged displaymen to execute these new cubist and futurist drapes now, so that display will prove most timely. The form of these drapes, they claimed, was not only eye-catching, but easy to execute. The advertisement explained how the cubist and futurist types of art were largely developed along straight lines, making the work of draping a simple matter. Whether it was simple or not, it certainly is eye-catching, and this wide-awake practice really facilitates itself through this direct alignment with modern art and the modern art market. And so here I think we can see how creative and commercial concerns of the window find this new sense of balance. The show window featured the skill of the hand as well as the power of the machine. And in 1905, a retail periodical reported on the advantages of featuring machinery in motion in the show window. He wrote, "The important point of a mechanical fitting is its irresistible attraction to the majority of men, women, and children, whose eyes are instantly caught by the spectacle of anything moving in the window." We think that Eric Brothers' presentation of a 3-ring circus in 1881 was probably the earliest use of an animated window by a New York City department store. But as early as 1883, as we see here, Macy's added mechanics to its Christmas windows, turning dolls and toys through steam power. Over 40 years of innovation later, by 1925, Macy's mechanical experiments had advanced to a fantastical animated spectacle made up of 26 stirring scenes with hundreds of marionette actors in a continuous performance, so reported the New York Evening Journal. And so mechanics were one of the kind of technological improvements in the show window that allowed for continual revision and animation and dynamism in the show window to keep the attraction of passersby. Now moving to the interior, retail strategists in this period suggested that interior decorations should uphold the standards set by the window displays. So when your eye was caught by a glorious window display, you should not be disappointed upon stepping foot into the store and beginning your real shopping experience. So small-scale tabletop arrangements on shelves too really mimicked the display strategies seen in the show window and provided this visual continuity. So here we see on the right, delicate work again with handkerchiefs. And fixtures also are key here in the elevation of merchandise, providing visual variety to the view. And also often fixtures serve to show off that kind of this regularization of industrial production. So it's not enough to show a single handkerchief, but why not show 100 in triangle formation up and down an aisle? And so here it's interesting to note how these rows of handkerchief pyramids are complemented with a number of other repeatable elements. We see evenly spaced chairs, sales staff, lighting fixtures, all sending messages of kind of organization and yet variety at the same time. And this expansive impression, this vanishing point, was very important in the department store's first impression on the consumer and really became a perceptible factor in the department store's embodiment of modernity. The introduction of a more open glass or open front plan, glass-fronted casework, lower fixtures, all contributed to this sense of spaciousness and openness and air and light that filled the department store interior. And was really a great departure from earlier stores that had piles of goods stacked high, dense casework, and little electric lighting. So this sense of openness was entirely key to not only encouraging consumers from one floor to the next, but asking them to stay a little bit longer in the store and making it a little bit more palatable to their senses. Because although something that is quite misleading is that many of the surviving imagery of the department store shows the store completely empty of all shoppers. We see these publicity images only featuring sales staff and the goods. And one has to imagine a space such as this being able to facilitate the viewing of merchandise and the motion of many, many consumers all at once. So this shift from clutter to spaciousness that we see at the start of the 20th century parallels really the shift within retail aesthetics that I was also discussing in the show window, the shift from the stocky window to the unit principle. So here we can see this casework in Marshall Field, how stylistically it has modified from tall, long, solid wooden masses to lighter glass-walled fixtures that have this shorter profile. And the Chicago Dry Goods Reporter even describes how Marshall Field's casework set up a pathway similar to the sidewalk, with glass-walled casework simulating the effect of the show windows. Again, the transparent nature of the glass is key in the show window and in the casework to give this sense of openness and afford this visuality to the goods. The article describes that on either side, tempting merchandise is divided into sections, which in reality are shops complete in every detail. So we see journalists again and again actually encouraging consumers and commuters to use the pathways of the department store, these long aisles, as actually a commuter route through the city. And in many cases, the kind of gridded nature of the store's pathways mimics the gridded nature of the store's streets. A leading manufacturer of shop fittings in America advertised their glass casework with the tagline, "When she sees, she buys." And so this transparent quality was absolutely essential in enabling the consumer to make the purchase and convert interest into action. The case's glass construction allowed for three-sided viewing, or even four-sided viewing, when a mirror was used in shelving along the back. The Detroit Showcase Company went one step further and advertised their casework models as silent salesmen, who encouraged consumers to not touch, but look, the very same message implied by the plate glass in the show windows. So these newer systems of shop fitting overrided over older processes that were largely built on the need for a salesperson to retrieve a piece of merchandise and show it to the consumer. Here, the silent salesman, the casework, was doing that work. And the casework was given this agency to facilitate the display and the sale. This advertisement's text encouraged this practice with the promise, "The best you can do is make a good display of your newest goods in a silent salesman all glass showcase, and let it do the suggesting to your customers." So shop fitters begin to advertise this narrative of the department store as an increasingly mechanical space, requiring less human interaction between salespeople and consumers, and therefore more interaction between people and shop fittings. So as we have seen through my kind of frequent citation of advertisements and press reports, the department store's culture of display was public-facing and professional, with an engaged audience. Stores recorded and promoted their histories and their displays with postcards and other ephemera. Displaymen authored guidebooks, wrote periodical articles, wrote textbooks, and made headlines with their imaginative schemes that earns the public's interest and their investment. It conditioned their attention to pay attention to not only what was on view, but how it was being displayed. And we can perceive how customers again and again start to choose one store over another due to the store's choice of display techniques and technologies. Department stores were great publishers and promoters of their own histories, and in some cases assembled their own archives to record, celebrate, and preserve these fleeting creative moments of their display staff. As we can see here, pictures of department store exterior and interiors fill postcards and fans, catalogs and pamphlets are illustrated with these kind of imageries. Department store imagery was used to advertise other technologies in the department store to prove progress and increase sales. It was used to validate successful growth in manufacturer catalogs. So this kind of visual material can be culled from a number of resources from this period. And I think what's important to note is that in reviewing this ephemera, we can identify how stores were not only advertising what they sold, but how they sold it, and how they advertised that their specific method of display was more important or more worthy of patronage than their competitors. These specific display aspects called for a specific retail experience. And it promotes the store's promotional techniques. So I'll finish up tonight by sharing one of my favorite examples of ephemera of this period. So at Christmas time in about 1894, Mrs. Vernon Baker of Saratoga, New York, received this oversized envelope in the mail. The department store Abraham and Straus had sent out this oversized mailing of the model department store. This was a promotional, collapsible, three-dimensional paper model that reproduced both exterior and interior views of the store's location, newly erected on 422 Fulton Street. Here we can see how four essential components of the department store experience come together and are being promoted. Architecture, window displays, shop fittings, and interior arrangement all will take prominence here. So again, this is a promotion that is promoting the store's promotional techniques. The monumental facade loomed over passersby, and its rows of windows both advertise merchandise and give views into the interior. They communicate order, they spread light, they offer enticing views of the merchandise that the consumer will experience once they step inside. At the same time, the facade shows us its organization. Its gridded frontality gives messages of organization, of soundness in business, as well as kind of modern architectural approaches towards combining a lot of merchandise under a single roof. The format of the mailing really duplicates the format of this architectural program of the store itself. The flat front represented the plane of the building's facade, and the perspectival fold-out design of the model mimics the layered effect of its sales floors. So this model department store metaphorically transports its recipient, who is a potential patron, into the store and positions them as a consumer. This three-dimensional model reveals this perspectival cutaway view of all that the department store has, this immersive power of display as the mediator between the consumer and the merchandise. The interior imagery conveys the layout that was designed to steer consumer movement and vision and to entice the public to keep exploring the store. The departmental organization is also very clear. We can see how apparel departments occupied the upper tiers, whose quieter and more private atmosphere was appropriate for the personal purchase of clothing. Furniture, lamps, china, and rugs could also be found on these upper floors due to their bulk. And yet the details of the merchandise are secondary here, I think, to the overall impression of their sophisticated display, which is the real message. This model department store also came with a sheet of cutout elements, including sales girls behind counters, a clock with ferns at its base, shoppers strolling hand in hand, and more. The recipient could construct the store by arranging the pieces on the sales floor according to their numbers. And what is interesting here is that this placement was devised by the store itself. So in looking back at the model, we can see how numbered squares and rectangles appear on that faux wood paneled floor, showing us exactly where Abraham and Straus intended these elements to be placed. Thus, the store really represented and publicized this assemblage of parts, this design of the department store that I've been talking about. But the store itself really encourages accurate placement of these elements to achieve the model department store appearance and performance of the store itself. So I think here the model department store really has dual meaning. The mailing itself is indeed a model. It's a facsimile of the existing store. But at the same time, Abraham and Straus was clearly designating itself as the model or the paragon of the modern shopping experience. And as I've discussed, at the time of this mailing, the model department stores features, policies were all being codified and celebrated and developed by retail executives and by designers, authors, educators, and journalists. And I think this model that was celebrated and successful and valid over 100 years ago is quickly losing its credibility. And I think now, faced more than ever with new challenges of health and safety, again, the department store is going to have to rely on display design to overcome these obstacles. And I think now more than ever, the department store as a site of design production remains ever relevant. So that's the end of my slides for tonight. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much. That last one is gorgeous. I think someone had asked, is it all women shoppers that they have for you to cut out?
Oh, that's a great question. Let's take a look. I think so. Well,
there's one gentleman too.
I would bet that man actually looks to me like a kind of uniformed department store employee. He looks like he is maybe welcoming a potential patron and pointing the right way, but he might well have been a customer himself as well. Men and women were equally welcome in the department store.
Well, thank you. And we'll actually open up for Q&A now. And we actually already have a question from Amy, so I will unmute you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for this really very interesting lecture. And I very much enjoyed it. Thank you. I have a question. You focused on department stores in the English-speaking world, but Paris had fantastic department store, Beaumarchais. They were very innovative, very progressive. For instance, Beaumarchais had bathrooms for women all across the store for the employees, not just the customers. Did you include in any way the influence of these French department stores upon the British or the American department store?
Definitely. Paris was an important shopping city and certainly very important to the history of the department store. In terms of my arguments, I think Paris is really a leader in terms of retail architecture at large. And what I did find in looking in department store archives were photos and correspondence with kind of retail entrepreneurs in leading Paris stores. But from the kind of specific aspects of the professionalization of department store display, I was really tracing this particular dialogue that happened between London, New York, and Chicago. And these three cities were the starting points for the founding of professional organizations. The shop fitting trade really grew mature in London more so than any other city. And so I began to see this triangulation of travel, of the display designers themselves really going between these three cities and shifting between important stores in all of them, as well as periodicals that were really targeting these three cities as well. So that triangulation became clear to me as I began my research, but certainly Paris is a very important story in this narrative as well.
But in this triangle, since Chicago is included in it, I was wondering if you gave any consideration in looking at Adolf Loh's design of a shop in Vienna. He was in the States. He designed, well, he never realized it, but he designed tower for Chicago, for the Chicago Press, the Tribune. He was very interested in American art. He designed the American Bar in Vienna. And he designed a smaller department store, not a department store, a smaller shop. Is there any connection, any influence of the American shops you had shown us and Adolf Loos's work?
I can't speak to that in particular, but I do know it's certainly a name that comes up in the literature in the period. There was kind of a rise in writing on the topic of retail design in general, and certainly his name is a like leader in the field, and consumers themselves are also traveling between these cities and comparing their experiences when they're going to World's Fairs, when they're going on the world tour. These stores are making guidebooks. So when a city puts out a guidebook, most often it includes not only you know, the important businesses to visit, but those that are well designed. So certainly it's an international conversation, and just for kind of the needs of narrowing the research, I had to choose some parameters, but
no, but it was wonderful.
Other stories to tell.
Yeah,
Awesome.
thank you.
Great. So I think Justin wanted to chime in.
Because this is Yale associated, you have to deal with the Yale tradition of someone making a statement before there's a question. So I'm the statement, he's the question. I'm going to challenge you, Emily. I'm a longtime fan, loved it. I'm going to challenge you, Emily, to think about the contemporary world. We talk about web designers as architects, and maybe Instagram and the web is a new kind of retail architecture. So instead of the death of the shop window, Instagram is the new shop window. And we've just moved into a new paradigm of what is eye-catching and will make people kind of pause and double click. So that's my comment. Now you get a question.
Hi, Emily. So my question, and first of all, congratulations on the book, is I kept thinking about when you were talking the question of the sidewalk, and what to me feels a little bit like a chicken and egg question, which is, does the department store help develop the concept of kind of strolling along the sidewalk, or are people strolling along the sidewalk and the department store becomes a form of entertainment for them? And I was wondering if in your research you came across this question of, because it's really an urban studies question in many ways about who is looking at these windows and why would they be walking by in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess to both of your points, I mean, John, I think the ephemerality aspect is so important, right? These windows were photographed and drawn and recorded at the time because it was a short-lived like visual statement, just in the way that we're all using Instagram to capture like the instantaneous thing that excites us and share, you know, and share it out. So I think that that impetus is still with us. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the department stores and their, you know, visual nature are being captured now more than ever. But I think to Justin's point about the sidewalk, it's interesting. Certainly stores, five and dime stores were famous for citing their stores on the sunny side of the sidewalk because they knew that that was where consumers would most often walk. So that kind of consideration was definitely taken into play in terms of the real estate of cities. But there's a interesting story of these guys who were actually hired by department stores to walk past a show window, stop in their tracks and gasp and build up a crowd around them. And so consumers were actually paid to be consumers and to be visual consumers on the street. And so this was a practice that was done, you know, in London, New York, and Chicago. I found instances of it in all three cities. So certainly stores were taking into consideration, you know, circulation in the city, the times that consumers were out as passersby, and that opportunity to, you know, turn them from a passerby into a consumer. And sidewalk kind of lengths and real estate were advertised too. You know, they take up aisles were called blocks long. So there was this absolute kind of parallel between the department store as an interior being measured by the kind of metrics of the urban exterior.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So we're actually going to move to one question from the chat. Katrina is asking, what was the correspondence and communications between the various stores more competitive or cooperative? Oh, sorry, was. Would the designers get patents on various display equipment, tools, or machines?
That's a great question. I never came across an individual display design being patented. I think, of course, in the literature, it's hard to read because it's all very kind of self-aggrandizing. They're promoting themselves and their own profession and how great and important it is. So I think you have to take everything with a bit of a grain of salt. But also written is about how, you know, a store, one can tell what display designer is at work by looking at a particular store window. So designers certainly did start to develop characteristics that they were known for, but these were also often shared out in guidebooks and periodicals. So I think it was a mix of kind of competition, and there were built-in kind of rubrics for competition hosted by periodicals and even cities themselves. They knew it was good for business and tourism, but also you know, an ingrained competition for sure, who was doing like the greatest and the latest. And I think these two things are happening side by side.
And I think we have another question from Amy.
Yes, in response to Justin and the dialogue between Emily and Justin, in the European tradition, you have the concept of the flaneur, especially in France, the person who walks around without a purpose in the city and looks. And the flaneur looks at windows and window shopping. I mean, he doesn't shop, but he just looks. And it is this look which is captured by, for instance, the beautiful decorated windows of the Beaumarchais, of the Lafayette, and so forth. And it's a whole tradition. And I very much think that Justin said it's a question of the chicken and the egg. No, the flaneur, the walking around the city was first, and then came the strategy to decorate the windows in such a way that you can see better. And I totally agree with your view of the theatrical aspect of the window. The cities were theaters, and as you know, in France, you sit outside and you watch the passers-by, and the passers-by watch you sitting in the cafe or the restaurant. So it is this culture of seeing and looking and be seen. And it's reinforced through these department stores and their windows.
Yeah. I would like to hear a little bit about some of these displays, especially you see nowadays, like when we used to walk down Fifth Avenue during Christmas time and see all the beautiful windows, how so many of them weren't even that much related to it anymore. It was just creating something beautiful. And like, how do you think that came about?
You mean not related to kind of merchandise or selling? And I think that kind of ties into the window being kind of reflective of other cultural moments or other events happening in the city. So the store windows are still used in that way, with cultural kind of arrangements between, say, a theater or an opera house, or a museum and a department store, kind of a cross-promotional cultural context. I think, you know, here the show window is really facilitating the catching of your eye and encouraging you to come inside to see more artistry and sending a message. Sometimes the message is not only tied to the function of goods, sometimes it can bring apart other cultural alliances. And that was something that the department store was certainly striving for. You know, we're not entirely all about business and commerce. We actually are kind of an important, you know, cultural monument, something that should be seen not only for its kind of financial and business leanings, but also for, you know, contributing to society and culture at large. And I think the artistry of the windows certainly, you know, still key into that.
Great. So I think that is all the questions that we have. So thank you so much, Emily. That was fascinating. And I really hope we can go back to looking at all those window displays soon. But thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and thank you all so much for coming. We hope to see you at one of our other lectures soon. We have a whole lineup. Just check out the website. But until then, stay safe and stay connected, and we'll see you next time.